Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first of our recorded sections about the Reconstruction period in American history. I hope everybody is doing really well, and I hope everybody is staying current with the full PowerPoints on Blackboard. Certainly make sure that if you've got questions about those or about the recordings or any aspect of the class, that you get in touch with me as soon as possible so that I can get you some guidance and feedback. The Reconstruction period is the roughly 10 to 15 years or so from the very end of the Civil War through the sort of latter part of the 1870s. And when we go through it over the next few sections, we're going to be looking at what Reconstruction was, how it functioned, some of the challenges that it presented, and then certainly how it wraps up in 1877. So, excuse me. So Reconstruction is essentially the result of the sort of fundamental split that takes place in the United States during the Civil War. So the Civil War, in essence, is Southern states leave the United States in order to form their own country. And during the period of the war, the two sides are fighting over whether there will be two different countries or not. And so as the war begins to resolve more in the favor of the Union, more in the favor of the North, then the question becomes, how do you negotiate bringing those Confederate states back into the country? And this is going to involve a lot of different areas of difficulty. For one, you have just the regular political kinds of problems that surround needing to readmit those states, needing to readmit the state representatives and senators in Congress, knitting those states back into the sort of national fabric. But you also then have economic issues, you have social issues, you have issues dealing with changes in race relations and race policy. You have the question of how do you treat the leaders of the Confederate government? How do you treat the leaders of the Confederate military? So there's a lot of different things that have to be taken into account during the Reconstruction period. And as we'll see, it is a pretty difficult period in a lot of ways, partially because of an unexpected change in leadership that happens right as Reconstruction is kind of kicking off. So we'll talk about a lot of those different things. And then other aspects of that are certainly going to be developed in a little bit more detail in the full PowerPoints as well. So make sure that you're checking those out. So Reconstruction is generally broken down into three different parts. Wartime Reconstruction, which, as the name kind of suggests, is the Reconstruction period while the Civil War is actually still going on. So that's basically 1864-ish to 1865. You then have Presidential Reconstruction, which is roughly 1865 to about 1867. And then, as we'll explain, there's a transition in terms of the sort of organ of the federal government that's actually leading Reconstruction policy around the year 1867. And so this leads then to what's called Congressional Reconstruction. It's also sometimes known as Radical Reconstruction. And it's called Radical Reconstruction not necessarily because the policies are more aggressive or more extreme or more radical, partially that, but more so because the entity that really leads Reconstruction policy during this time are the radical Republicans in Congress. And so it comes to be known as Radical Reconstruction, more because of the sort of control that the radical Republicans have over Reconstruction policy for the last not quite a decade of Reconstruction's sort of chronology. So we'll talk about each one of these. We'll talk about how and why the transitions exist from one to the other. And we'll talk then about some of the broader kinds of implications behind Reconstruction, not only for the time period, but also going forward in American history as well. So during the Civil War, there is this sort of ongoing process by which the Army of the Union, or armies, I guess, of the Union, the northern states, managed to acquire more and more and more territory in the Confederacy. So the Confederacy is states like Virginia, the Carolinas, Tennessee, Arkansas, Texas, Louisiana, the deep south of places like Georgia, Alabama, down into Florida, stuff like that, right? So during the war itself, especially by the year 1863 and into 1864 and 65, the armies of the North are pushing deeper and deeper and deeper into Confederate territory. And so the map here gives a sense of where and when some of this territory comes under the control of the Union forces. And so you can see by 64 and 65, there are fewer and fewer and fewer territories or areas of the Confederacy that are completely under the control of the Confederacy itself. So by 1865, you have southern and central Virginia, the Carolinas, most of Alabama, Florida, Texas, and so on. But there are big chunks of Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, northern Virginia that are all under the control of the Union. And so as this is happening, it's pretty clear to the military and political leadership of the North that some kind of plan, some kind of policy needs to be put in place to deal with how the transition is going to be managed. And so, unfortunately, this is really pretty haphazard. The control of wartime Reconstruction is really up to the individual commanding officer in a particular area. So this is not something that gets a lot of guidance from the president. It's not something that gets a lot of guidance from Congress. It's not even something that gets a lot of guidance from the Department of the Army, because it really is a case-by-case, boots-on-the-ground kind of situation where the individual commander of some particular territory that has now come under the control of the Union Army, he has to determine how he wants to sort of operate Reconstruction policy. And it's a very, very complex situation. You have to deal with, in some cases, a fairly hostile population that sees the Union Army as an invasion force, right? Just because 5 years, 10 years before, everybody was part of the same country, that doesn't mean that in central Georgia or in northern Mississippi, that when a Union Army moves in, that the people there recognize, oh, hey, you know, these are Americans, we're just going to all get along. For years, parts of this Confederate States of America had considered themselves an independent country. And so as the Union forces are moving in, the local population is going to perceive them as an invasion/occupation force. The economy of the South, which was never really very diverse and certainly never very industrialized, is being devastated by the war, right? The demands of providing the resources necessary to power the Confederate war effort are extreme. In addition, in some cases, such as Sherman's march to the sea through Georgia, the purpose of the Union presence was as much to devastate the Southern economy as it was to reduce the fighting capacity of the Army itself. And so there are big areas of the Southern economy that are damaged or hampered, and other areas that are simply wiped out completely. And so this is going to add another layer of difficulty for wartime reconstruction. The other big challenge is what to do about the Emancipation Proclamation. So in 1862, going into effect on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and essentially it says, any slave in a state that is in rebellion against the United States, so any enslaved person anywhere in the Confederacy, is free according to the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation. But that needs to be enforced because it is going into effect and applying to, at the time, territory that is not under the direct control of the United States government. It's under the control of the Confederate States of America. And so, as Union forces move into these territories and begin to establish a presence, it's really up to the individual commanding officer how far he wants to stretch the Emancipation Proclamation. There are a lot of Union soldiers, there are a lot of Union officers, and there are a number of Union generals who are really not that interested in emancipation. They were fighting the war for the Union. And so there are a lot of cases where Union commanding officers don't really enforce the requirements of the Emancipation Proclamation. There are other cases when, as Union forces move in, slaves escape or leave their plantations. They leave the locations where they are enslaved, because not all enslaved people are working on plantations. That's kind of a generalization. And so they try to make contact with the Union armies, etc., etc. And some generals actually return these people to their owners, quote-unquote owners. And so it's a very, very haphazard, very uncoordinated, and disjointed application of Reconstruction during wartime Reconstruction, partially because there's no clear guidance from supreme authorities like the Department of the Army or Congress or the President, and partially because individual commanders in different places where Reconstruction is being applied have very different ideas about what Reconstruction should be. Some of them want to punish the South for the war. Others have a more magnanimous and at least benign kind of approach where they say, well, let bygones be bygones. So it's a very, very different kind of situation. But there still does need to be some kind of plan. And Lincoln never really comes out with clear specifics. In his second inaugural address, which he delivers in March of 1865, he does indicate that he would like Reconstruction to be generous, to be positive, and not to be punitive, right? He doesn't want Reconstruction, he doesn't want the years after the war to be about punishing the South for the war. He feels that the war has been more than enough punishment for everybody, and it wouldn't do any good to attempt another level of vengeance or retribution. And he has basically one clear requirement, and that is for the South to be readmitted to being part of the Union. Every Southern state has to recognize emancipation, the freeing of the slaves, as part of that readmission process. That's really the only absolute requirement that Lincoln will not budge on. Apart from that, he's fairly open-minded in terms of how he sees Reconstruction progressing. And this doesn't go over well with a lot of people in his administration. It doesn't go over well with a lot of people in the military or in Congress. We tend to think of Lincoln as this kind of superhuman figure, right? This almost the closest thing to a secular kind of god that you can have, right? Almost an infallible person who everybody deferred to and everybody recognized his sort of transcendent ability. And that's not the case, right? At the time, there were lots of people, even members of his own cabinet, who did not trust him, that did not feel that he was capable, didn't feel he was qualified, didn't feel he was deserving. And so he struggled to get support for a lot of his different policies and a lot of his different ideas. And his idea of a generous Reconstruction is one of those areas where Lincoln really, really struggles. He has a great deal of difficulty convincing people not to want to punish the South. And so he and Congress are really at loggerheads over how Reconstruction should proceed. Congress comes up with an idea in July of 1864, as it's starting to become clear that the North is almost certainly going to win. The question is, how long will it take? How much more devastation will be involved? But it seems pretty likely that the North is going to come out on top. And so Congress comes up with what's called the Wade-Davis Bill. And the Wade-Davis Bill is a fairly restrictive idea for how to organize Reconstruction, especially in terms of admitting the states, readmitting the states. And so according to the Wade-Davis Bill, one of the essential requirements before a state could be readmitted to the United States is there has to be a loyalty oath of 50% of the state's registered voters have to swear that they never aided the Confederacy. So half of the registered voters of each Confederate state, each Southern state, would have to swear that they had never assisted the Confederacy. Lincoln only wanted 10%. So a much, much lower threshold for that. According to the Wade-Davis Bill, there were also requirements that states who re-enter the Union have to have legal protections for the rights, the freedoms that freed slaves can expect, especially in federal court. So this isn't quite rising to the level of equality. It's not saying now that enslaved people are free, they will now be exactly equal to white citizens in America. It's not saying that. We'll talk about some of the challenges surrounding that idea in one of a future section here. But it is saying there will be certain protections for former slaves in federal court, and those can't be taken away. It also says that in order to re-enter the Union, these states will have to create new constitutions, and those constitutions will have to be drafted in conventions with delegates that had never assisted the rebellion, that never assisted the Confederacy in the Civil War. And this, as you may be kind of recognizing already, brings up some very serious problems. The probably most significant has to do with that issue of who you are extracting these loyalty oaths from, who you are allowing to serve in these state constitutional conventions. And the question becomes, how do you accept a loyalty oath of 50% of the state's registered voters. And the matter is not, because a lot of times people think, oh, well, how can you trust that the person is telling the truth when they swear that oath? And sure, that's something to keep in mind. But if you recognize, we assume in a lot of really important cases that people who take oaths are going to tell the truth, right? We assume that in terms of court cases when witnesses have to swear that they're going to tell the truth. We assume that with people that join the military who take an oath in their induction ceremony. We assume that with presidents, right? We expect that a president that takes an oath to support and defend the Constitution will actually do that. Whether they do or don't kind of varies from time to time. But the assumption is always there. The assumption that we have in this case is not, well, how can you guarantee that the people that are swearing that oath are being honest? The question is more that who would be the state's registered voters? Well, white men, right? Who would be the people most likely to support the Confederate cause? White men. The other issue here is a very loose definition of aid to the Confederacy. In other words, yes, obviously, if you join Robert E. Lee's army and you're going and you're fighting at Chancellorsville and you're fighting at Gettysburg and you're fighting at Petersburg, yes, obviously you are aiding the Confederate cause. Or if you are serving in the Confederate government, right, you are aiding the Confederate cause. Those are obvious. But other definitions of aid to the Confederacy even included things like if you were at home making bandages that would be used by soldiers in Robert E. Lee's army, if you were at home growing crops that made their way into bread, right, if you were growing wheat that made its way eventually into bread that was being eaten by the Confederate army, if you were sewing uniforms, if you were doing practically anything that in some way or another ended up in the hands of the Confederate government or the Confederate army, you were deemed to have been aiding the Confederacy. So there's virtually no way that you could ever say that half of the population of these Confederate states would be able to legitimately swear that they had not aided the Confederacy. So what would be the only way that you could get there? Well, the only way you could get there would be if you would wait for the Confederate generation to die. And then the population would cycle through to a point where people would be born who simply could not have been able to aid the Confederacy between 1860 and 1865. So the Wade-Davis bill is not a plan for immediate Reconstruction. It's not a plan for rapid readmission. It is a plan that says we will keep the former Confederacy in this sort of subject state, or state of subjection, until the Confederate generation is dying off. So this would be 20, 30, 40, 50 years, potentially. The other question then becomes, how do you deal with those state constitutional conventions, right? The people you would want to be involved in drafting those constitutions are the people with political experience, they're the people with legal know-how and legal experience. These are the very same people that were involved in creating the Confederacy and in running the Confederacy politically. So here again, you're saying the people who should be drafting these new constitutions can't have any connection with the Confederacy, so we have to wait that out too. This is really the only plan that's presented during wartime Reconstruction that offers an idea, a roadmap for how to proceed. Lincoln obviously could not accept this, right? He could not agree to this plan because it's way too punitive. It's way too restrictive. But Lincoln also recognized that he couldn't just veto the bill outright and say, nope, we're not going to do this, because he didn't have a clear plan, and he didn't have enough support for his ideas to be able to present an alternative. So he couldn't be the person that just kills off this idea without there be something else in readiness to bring up as an option. So Lincoln uses a loophole, a congressional or a constitutional loophole that's known as the pocket veto, right? And the pocket veto we won't go into in detail. Suffice to say that it basically wipes out the Wade-Davis bill. It makes it so that bill doesn't go into effect. But Lincoln doesn't have the kind of negative press, the bad optics of having done in this idea 100%. So the problem is there's still no solution, and it's increasingly important that there become some kind of a solution, right? Especially because the war ends, basically, April 9th, 1865. Now, there are still going to be skirmishes and things that happen after that for a few months, but for all intents and purposes, everybody recognizes that Lee's surrender on April 9th is going to end the war. And so in the midst of the euphoria and excitement about the end of this horrendous 4-year-long war, there needs to be some kind of clear Reconstruction policy, right? It has to be immediate, it has to be comprehensive, and Lincoln seems as though he has lots of political capital that he can spend. He has just basically led the country through the worst crisis in its history. He is recognized throughout the North as the savior of the Union, and basically whatever Lincoln wants, he's going to be able to get within reason. And so he needs to begin planning Reconstruction. But then, tragedy of all tragedies, less than a week after the surrender, Lincoln is shot. He is shot April 14th. He dies the next morning. He was the best chance that the South had for a moderate Reconstruction policy. Even though Lincoln oftentimes struggled to get his policies supported, he probably wouldn't have had a great deal of difficulty in this case. Hard to say, because, you know, again, historians aren't typically all that happy about these kinds of what-if questions. But the odds are good that Lincoln would have been able to manage this. But when Booth assassinates Lincoln, he is, from his mind, assassinating a tyrant, right? Booth says, I'm killing the person who is the worst enemy that the South has. He's one of the great tyrants and despots in all of world history. I'm going to assassinate Lincoln. His plan is that this will allow the Confederacy to catch its breath, reorganize, and begin the war all over again. That obviously doesn't happen. But the worst thing about this is that it puts the policy of Reconstruction in the hands of, initially, Lincoln's vice president, a man named Andrew Johnson, and then ultimately in the hands of Congress by 1867 or so, when Congressional Reconstruction emerges as the dominant kind of force behind Reconstruction policy. And so you have this shocking 1 week period where the war ends. Reconstruction is suddenly an immediate necessity. But then within the week, Reconstruction becomes the responsibility of people and entities, political entities that are far less capable of managing it than Lincoln would have been. And so that's where we're going to go in our next section, right? We're going to talk about presidential Reconstruction. We'll talk about Johnson, some of the difficulties that he faces, some of his personality issues and character defects that will cause problems, and then lead into how and why congressional Reconstruction then comes to the forefront, really at the expense of Johnson himself. So that's going to be our next goal. Let me know if you've got questions about anything. I hope everybody does well, and I will see everybody again very soon.